We're going to jump right in it and discuss the 5 components of a text. Now, I only say that because these are 5 things that every single text has, and they're conceptual and practical. And if you're integrating it, you can move away from those band 3 and those band 4 marks, and then even get higher and higher up to a band 6, depending on what you include when you're talking about these. You guys have already done at least 2 close textual studies. So you've already looked at least 2 texts. Now, whether that's 2 books or a book and a movie or whatever you've looked at in class, you've looked at least 2. So this is just going to help your general view of text as a whole. So expanded, they refer to this. So context, and context is what was the author's context versus ours. So the author's context is the time that they made it and the year and the period. Obviously, Shakespeare's context is going to be a very different context to ours, because Shakespeare was writing a lot of his works in the 1600s. Very different world, very different values compared to our values. Then there's the purpose, and what's the author's purpose? Are they trying to put out a message? Are they trying to challenge a stereotype? Are they trying to catalyze our reflection? Are they trying to make us think? We have to stop and think, okay, well, what's the purpose of it? The values are what values underpin the text. Is it the author's, and is it also ours? So some of the values might be forgiveness, redemption, respect, just some of those general values that a lot of the texts are about. Audience reception is how does the way we receive the text compare to the original context, and that's really got to do with our changing context and how our changing values. For example, we live in a much more secular society where there isn't as much influence from spirituality and religion. And I just finished our SOR lecture that we just did. So if anyone does SOR in year 12, you look a lot at the changing statistics in Australia, and Christianity has been on a major decline, and secularism, which is people claiming to be no religion at all, is on the rise and on the trend to, in a couple years, replace, and the most popular religion in Australia is set to be no religion. So that just shows, when you compare that to Shakespeare's society, which was very heavily Christian, and being able to compare the two, there's just a big difference that you can make on audience reception. And then we're going to talk about the form and then the different aspects of form. So context shapes text, but text shape context. I know that sounds so like back and forth, but we're going to look into it. Context is what you know, it's the circumstances of something. So the context can be political, so how the power is influencing the text, the political climate of the time. It can also be social, so it can be the features of the society. It can be literary, so how other techniques influence the prescribed text. So are other texts using the same techniques, or are they doing something completely different? Is your author going against the conventions in the traditional writing style of the time, or are they following it? And that's all got to do with the context, but also the personal context. And a lot of the time, the personal context has some of the most. I think personal and social are some of the easier ones to write about, because the personal context just comes up so much, and especially if the author's writing from their own experience, it does impact just their individual experiences when we're looking into context. So for political and for social, personal, literary, you can ask yourself these types of questions. So what was the composer's childhood like? What kind of education did they receive? What influence of their health? What's their relationship status? What's their gender? Are they a public figure? How are they perceived? Same with political systems. You can ask, well, who was in power at the time? What were the key policies? Were there any key historical events or wars? And all of that type of stuff is going to affect the type of text that you guys do. So if you guys are in the live chat, hopefully we can have a bit of a talk about what text you guys have done in class, and we can try and see if we can connect that to context. So values are essentially the concepts that are explored in your text. So different values are more prevalent during different contexts, while some values remain universally relevant. So our context affects the way that we receive and view values. So for example, the value of human connection is becoming more important in our modern context as technology gains popularity. Back in the maybe 1600s, when realistically what technology was there, human connection was just so natural and was just so inherent. It was kind of like instinct. But for us now, when we're so used to scrolling on TikTok and all over Insta, liking each other, texting each other, it's not as easy to have that human connection. A lot of people are losing human connection, and even stuff like artificial intelligence and people starting to start relationships with that. I saw the other day on TikTok, there's an AI dating app that's out there now. So you can date and talk to like an artificial intelligent robot. So you can imagine what that does for human connection. That's such a random example, but it's just a fact that as technology is gaining more popularity and as our social connection is changing, we now have to value human connection more because it's being threatened. But it wasn't being threatened back then, and that's the differences that you can make in context. There's a lot of universal values as well, and values at the core kind of stay the same. Like gender, revenge, race, decay, religion, empowerment, jealousy, loyalty, love. They've been around forever. Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, love story. Love story. I don't care. I don't care. It's a love story. It's a love story, and the value is love. The value is love, but it's also looking at power, and these are like universal values that never change. So if you ever hear like, oh, universal value, universal theme, um it kind of like transcends times or something, there's like a timeless theme or timeless value, all that means is that it exists throughout time. And realistically, betrayal has existed all throughout time. All throughout time. Power has always been a thing. Gender has always been a thing. Revenge, go back to like the ancient Greeks, like this, it's always been a thing. And you can go back to mythology and go back to all these different wars, and all these values are there in history. So universal values and themes are just at the core across the whole universe for just however long humans have been here. These have been our values, and they can kind of be recycled in new and exciting ways. Like love now compared to love what would have been back then. Like maybe there's Romeo and Juliet back then, but now we've got like Instagram and dating apps, and that's going to really change how like people's love language and all of that. That's just an example of how it can be the same value, but it can be portrayed in a new light for the sake of context, if that makes sense. Same with betrayal. A betrayal back then was an eye for an eye. So if you kill my brother, you know what? I'm going to go kill yours. We don't live in that type of society anymore where that's allowed. A betrayal now could be like going to be friends, having like a friend break up and then going to be friends with her ex-best friend or a girl that doesn't like her on purpose. That's a betrayal, and like a betrayal of like loyalty, for example. And that's just an example of how, yes, the value is the same, but it's going to be portrayed differently because of the sake of time changing. And as time changes, so do our values, so do our beliefs, so does legislation and what's socially acceptable. And you guys can even see, if you look at kids now, like I remember my parents were always like, oh, you kids and your technology, blah, blah, blah. But when I look at like younger kids now and how connected they are to iPads, we didn't grow up like that. We definitely grew up with technology, but it wasn't in the same way when you see those kids like with those grippy iPad cases like stuck to it. We weren't like that. And in such a small gap, how could things have changed so quickly? So imagine when there's hundreds of years apart, how quickly things are changing. It's very important to remember that. So you want to ask yourself how the composer is speaking through their text to influence you. All texts have a purpose, all of them have a message, and all the composers want to leave us with this type of message, and the purpose is shaped by their context and their values. So context and values are working together to shape meaning. And then the purpose is manifested through the techniques that they use. And sometimes they might use a metaphor or some really great imagery to show that purpose, and they won't be as specific, but it's up to the author and what they choose. Now, form is an explicit choice by the author, and it's the way in which the composer makes their purpose known. So the macro format is the text type. So is it a play? Is it a poem? Is it a fiction? Is it a speech? Is it a letter? While the micro is the literary conventions, and literary conventions, if you ever hear that, don't freak out. It literally just means the techniques. So is it satire? Is it rhyme? Is it repetition? Is it a simile? So the macro is the big thing, and the macro is really just the genre of the text. So what type of text is it? That's going to obviously influence the shape of the text, because a Shakespeare play is very different to a poem. But the micro is the techniques, and again, Shakespeare was using pretty different techniques to what we're using today. And a lot of dramatic irony, a lot of stage directions, because that's going to suit a play. But if you're doing a poem, you don't really need stage directions. And that's just the difference with the different texts. So form shapes the meaning of a text, and we perceive stories differently when they take different shapes. So a novel is not the same as a YouTube video, and a horror movie is not the same as a poem. So different forms can therefore highlight different values and different contexts of different texts. So Then we get into audience reception, which is what is the text impact on us? How does it make us feel? Does it make me re-question what I believed about this theme or this value? Does it consolidate what I already know? Does it just prove and be like, you know what, I already believe that, this just makes me believe it more? Does it challenge your belief and make you reflect and be like, wait, do I even think that? Or, oh, maybe my opinion has changed. And consider the extent to which we as the audience shape the meaning of a text. Is it us? Did he write that meaning? Is it for us? Is the meaning to make us think? It's just some important questions to ask yourself. So now that you know the 5 components, each aspect you can see feeds into each other. And I know it seems like, oh, there's context, oh my gosh, there's values, purpose, form, audience, like you're doing all these things at once, but all of them flow onto each other. And the only reason that we as an audience can even have that reception and we can question and we can be like, oh, is it a challenge? Is it a similarity? Is because of the context and because of the values that are so universal. So, for example, the Shakespeare context is Elizabeth, England. And if we're talking about Hamlet, it was a tragic play that he literally wrote for the Queen, and it explores revenge, deception, loyalty, and inner conflict. Here we've got Lion King, 1994, hundreds of years later. A kid's film, it's a musical, it's animated, and it's funny, but it explores revenge, deception, loyalty, and inner conflict. What's the similarity here? The actual universal values are exactly the same. And from there, you can see that even though, imagine how different Hamlet is to the Lion King. How could I possibly sit here and compare Shakespeare to this kid's musical? But the fact that it's looking at the exact same values shows that different contexts, at the core, humanity is still the same. And it's still these same values at the core and at the foundation. So I just wanted to get that across. But by making sure that every element of your analysis is worthwhile and every element of your analysis is somehow linking to one of those themes, I promise you, you'll be able to answer any question you get. And a lot of the questions, especially in Year 11 Prelim English, are coming from those main 5 ideas. They're coming from context, they're coming from purpose, form, values, and audience reception. So I really recommend just knowing it in pretty good detail, and I hope that made sense. If it didn't and you have any questions to clarify, please ask in the live chat. But a lot of questions are coming straight from it. And you can even get something so basic like, how does the author show how the values influenced the context? Or what was the purpose of writing this text? How does the author engage with audience reception? Something super simple, but it makes sure that you don't have to waffle, and like, teachers love it. Teachers love it, and it's just what they want to see, but not enough students are doing it. And even in Year 12, this is still feedback that a lot of my tutoring students in Year 12 coming close to their trials are still getting. It's like, talk about the values, talk about the context. So if you guys can start doing that from now, I promise you it's really going to help out in your HSC and as you get into Year 12 as well. So let's talk about what a paragraph is going to look like. I'm sure you guys did Peel, and I still use Peel to this day in university. I don't care if you did Peel, if you did Teal, it's a very good technique. But this is just more of a in-depth analysis where you'd start your paragraph with a really unique idea about that paragraph theme. You're going to do quote with the technique and then the effect of the technique. You want to link that to the audience and how that helps us understand the author's value. And then how then through that it achieves purpose, make a link to context, and then the audience reception, and then you'd repeat it 2 to 3 times depending on how many quotes to do. So that's essentially what you could do. I know looking at that is like, makes you want to cry. It's kind of like pedal, but that's just an example. I know there's a lot there, but if you wanted to get at every single of the 5 elements at every single one, that is something that you could do. Others are going to look like this, and it's all going to vary. It was very important that you guys understand from Year 11 is that there's no one way to do things. And I know that's annoying, and I know it'd be great if it's like, okay, everybody write this amount of quotes, everybody do this amount of paragraphs, everybody write about these themes, but it's just not how it is. And the point of English is that there is that potential for expression and that potential to kind of experiment with different things. So don't look at this. If you're looking at this and this makes no sense, which, don't even feel embarrassed, because when I was first making these slides, and this is just the structure that we recommend here at ATAR Notes that's been working really well for a lot of our Year 11 students in prelims. when I first was like putting these in, I was like, am I gonna keep this in because I don't want to confuse anyone, because it can be really confusing. And even looking at it now, I'm like, there is a lot going on all at once. But realistically, each of these is all one section. So that's one quote, that's all for one quote, that's all for one quote, and that's all for one quote. I know it seems like a lot, but because it's all in terms of it, of the of what you're doing as well, it can seem overwhelming. But I promise, when you actually write it, or even if you just wanted to try writing just that, like take a screenshot of it, and you can like put it above your work and then write a paragraph or write like a part of it with that, I promise it will make more sense. So here's an example of how to do it. We even have it color coded for you guys so you guys can see. So we've got the intimacy of her metaphors, and then we've got the quote. So recognition of her confessional poetry as an authentic recount into the wounds she suffered as a result of her restrictions as mother, wife, and inability to assert her own identity. I'm not going to read the entire thing, guys, because you're 100% going to get tired of my voice by the end of it. So the last thing I need to do is start reading to you. But if you guys want to quickly have a read through of the rest of that, and we'll just have a quick talk about them. So if you guys had a read of that, hopefully that makes more sense. I feel like just looking at this like is so scary, but when you're looking at it here, everything kind of flows like onto each other, and it all just works out. So hopefully that makes sense for you guys. Now, from the excerpt, you can see that all the bigger aspects of the text, so context, values, and purpose, depend on form so that they can be expressed, which is why your form is so important. And form literally is really just your techniques and the style of writing that they're following. And your quotes are going to speak about a certain value, and it's going to link to what the author's purpose in highlighting that value is. So this is an example, and this one is from an actual year 12 text, so you guys can get an idea of like the year 12 standard. I wanted to put something for you guys, but again, in year 12 you can still use this same format to make sure that you're linking back to all the ideas that you need to. So if you want to have a quick read of this one too about the reflective nature. So if you guys had a quick read of that, that's just another example. I'm so sorry, I just don't want to read them all out to you. But that's just another example, and I feel like I said, like looking at that, it is quite a lot. But when you see it written out loud, and I think that's the most important thing, and I definitely think that's a tip moving forward, is that you don't necessarily need to follow every single step. And I feel like sometimes, especially when you're looking at structural things, and it's like, okay, number one, do this, number two, do this, number three, do this, it's really overwhelming. But then when you see it finished and you see an exemplar or you see a sample of it being done, you're like, oh, that's actually not that hard. And it's actually not doing too much at once. It actually flows really nicely. So that's just another hint that when you are looking for stuff online, try to find, if you are going to look for structure and like past papers or any past essays that you're looking at, try to find work that has a sample and has an example of how to put that into practice, because it's not enough to just see this. Even I would still, if this was the first time that I had ever seen it, I would be so confused with how much is going on. So that's just an example of what to do.